On an early autumn afternoon in the village of Ravenwood, Harriet Collins leaned over her low garden wall to chat with her neighbor, Mrs. Dempsey, about the upcoming harvest festival. After decades of teaching literature to restless teenagers at the nearby secondary school, Harriet had retired to a life of gentle pursuits, gardening, reading, and indulging her insatiable curiosity about local legends. She hadn't anticipated that her next great project would be unraveling a mystery that Ravenwood had nearly forgotten. Once Mrs. Dempsey departed, Harriet slipped into her cozy cottage and settled in her favorite armchair. The fading leaves drifted outside her window, blanketing the quiet street in copper and gold. Harriet sipped her tea, thinking about her next errand, a visit to the local charity shop to donate some clothes that no longer fit quite right. While she prided herself on minimalism, Harriet had always been drawn to rummaging through old books and relics, not to keep, but simply to learn their history. The streets of Ravenwood bustled with gentle energy that day as Harriet strolled toward the high street. Residents were preparing for the harvest festival, stringing up wreaths of dried flowers and pumpkins in front of the shops. The church bells tolled softly in the distance, prompting Harriet to admire the crisp air and tranquil surroundings. She stepped into the charity shop, an establishment owned by a kind-hearted woman named Loretta Green. Loretta had taken over the shop from her grandmother and maintained it with a passion that far exceeded mere business. After depositing her bag of clothes, Harriet browsed the store. A row of old china cups caught her eye, each delicately painted with scenes of pastoral life. Pretty as they were, Harriet's gaze drifted to a small glass case containing an assortment of brooches, rings, and other trinkets. She leaned in. One item in particular made her pause: a silver locket. It wasn't especially ornate, a simple oval shape with a faint inscription on the back. Something about it seemed inexplicably familiar. She waved Loretta over. "Mind if I take a closer look at that locket?" Harriet asked, pointing into the case. Loretta lifted the locket out and placed it in Harriet's palm with careful reverence. "I only got this in last week. An elderly gentleman came by to donate a box of odds and ends. I haven't appraised anything yet." Harriet turned the locket around in her hand. The tarnish indicated it was old, and the faint letters shining through the dull metal spelled out a set of initials: E.M. A small hinge along the right side suggested it could be opened, but it looked stuck. "Do you mind?" she asked. With Loretta's nod, Harriet tried to open the clasp. At first it refused to budge. Then with a soft click it yielded. Inside were two small photographs. The images almost faded away. On the left side was a teenage girl, her hair pinned back, wearing a modest frock. On the right was a slightly older woman, eyes bright, as if caught mid-laugh. Both images had the same shape of face, the same dimple on one cheek. Mother and daughter, Harriet guessed. Gently, she snapped the locket shut. "I'll take it," Harriet said softly, surprising herself. It wasn't at all like her to collect jewellery, but she knew she wanted to examine it more carefully. Loretta smiled. "If anyone can figure out its story, it'll be you. You have a knack for that sort of thing." After paying for the locket, Harriet left the shop. She walked home, mind busy with questions. E.M. Who could that be? And why did the photographs look so hauntingly familiar? That evening, Harriet set the locket on her coffee table, along with her reading glasses and a small magnifying glass she had once used in her classroom to faithfully analyze lintels and lettering in old books. Ravenwood, though homely and peaceful, had its share of rumors and stories that trickled down through the decades. She vaguely remembered hearing about a missing girl many years ago, a disappearance that had never been solved. Could these pictures be related? She leaned in to study the faces again. The older woman wore a pendant similar to the locket itself. The chain was clearly visible around her neck. Harriet's breath caught. The teenage girl. She was sure she had seen that photograph somewhere before. On impulse, Harriet rummaged through her bookshelf for a local history volume. She had read it years ago when first exploring Ravenwood's past. After scanning the table of contents, she flipped toward a chapter labeled Tragedies and Troubles. And there, on a page discussing a young woman called Elizabeth Morton, Harriet's gaze came to rest on a single black and white photograph. It depicted a smiling mother and daughter standing outside a stately Victorian house. The resemblance was astonishing. Elizabeth Morton had once been one of Ravenwood's most promising young women. Her disappearance, decades before Harriet had moved to the village, had baffled everyone. She had apparently left home one morning on an errand, but never returned. No trace of her was found. Harriet recalled reading about frantic searches, desperate pleas, but nothing had turned up. There had been quiet speculation that maybe Elizabeth had eloped or ran away. Yet rumors insisted something more sinister lurked beneath the surface. The older figure in the photograph must have been her mother, Margaret Morton. Now Harriet felt certain that the locket had once belonged to Elizabeth. But how had it ended up at the charity shop all these years later? The next morning, Harriet awoke with a determination that she had not felt since grading stacks of final exams in her teaching days. She intended to revisit the local history archives at the library. If Elizabeth Morton's case was truly unresolved, Harriet would see if the locket might help shed new light on the matter. Inside the library, dust motes floated in the sunlight that beamed through the tall windows. Despite technology's advances, the library retained a certain old-world charm. Wooden shelves groaning with books, a hush of respect for the written word all around. Harriet made her way to the archive room in the back, where local genealogies and historical records were kept in filing cabinets. She greeted Mr. Stevenson, the archivist, who greetedly helped Harriet gather all the relevant files on the Morton family. Harriet spent hours poring over brittle newspaper clippings, birth records, and scraps of hearsay. The Mortons had once been quite prominent in Ravenwood, known for a large orchard on the outskirts of town. By all accounts, Margaret Morton had been a devoted mother to Elizabeth, especially after Elizabeth's father passed away. Newspaper articles recounted that Elizabeth was last seen near the orchard's boundary. One neighbor reported hearing voices, an argument, but the details were inconclusive. Harriet wondered if the orchard itself held a clue. Perhaps time had erased the evidence. But Harriet would not be deterred. Her curiosity flared brighter with each new piece of information. Along the margin of a particular newspaper report was a name scribbled in faint pencil. Mary Caldwell. Intrigued, Harriet read further. Mary Caldwell had been a close friend of Elizabeth's. A rumor suggested that Mary was the last person to see Elizabeth alive, but she had since moved away. Then Harriet discovered a small paragraph that mentioned, somewhat tangentially, the caretaker of the Morton orchard, a fellow named Edmund. Harriet paused. E.M., the initials on the locket. Could Edmund have had a role in Elizabeth's disappearance? Her mind buzzed with possibilities. She scanned for references to Edmund in the local genealogies. Edmund had been employed by Margaret Morton for many years, looking after the orchard's trees and farmland. He had gained Margaret's trust, especially after her husband's passing. Then Harriet saw a note. Edmund Marsh. There it was, E.M.M. Marsh. The caretaker's connection to the orchard and his initials matching those carved on the locket was almost too coincidental. Had the caretaker and Elizabeth been close? Could the locket have belonged not to Elizabeth, but to Edmund? Harriet decided to talk to someone who might remember the orchard in its heyday. She left the library with a surge of purpose and hurried to the post office. There, behind the counter, stood Mildred Page, who had been living in Ravenwood for nearly 80 years. If anyone had a recollection of Elizabeth Morton and her family, it would be Mildred. When Harriet politely inquired about the orchard, Mildred's expression grew reflective. "I remember it well. It was a lovely place," she said, placing a stack of letters aside. "Margaret Morton was kind and generous. People whispered about her caretaker, though. Some said he was too close to the family. Others felt he was fiercely protective of Elizabeth." Harriet leaned closer to the counter. "Edmund Marsh, right? Do you recall ever seeing him with a silver locket? A flicker of recognition danced in Mildred's eyes. Now that you mention it, I remember Edmund had a trinket he wore on a chain. Used to say it was a special keepsake from Miss Elizabeth. He was heartbroken when she went missing, practically beside himself. Mildred lowered her voice conspiratorially. When the official search ended, he kept on looking, months, even years later. Curiosity was practically radiating from Harriet. What happened to him? In time, he fell ill. Margaret passed not long after Elizabeth's disappearance. Heartbreak, they said. Then the orchard changed hands. People lost track of Edmund. Some folks assumed he moved on to a new job or left town altogether. But I heard from a friend that Edmund never fully recovered from losing Elizabeth. His family might have put him in a care home in the neighbouring county. Harriet nodded, her mind swirling with theories. Thank you, Mildred. You've been a tremendous help. She tucked the locket securely into her handbag and considered her next step. It was possible someone in that neighbouring county might still recall Edmund Marsh. Harriet decided to take a short trip and do some old-fashioned footwork to uncover more. The following day, she boarded a local bus that wound its way through the countryside. Fields of gold and green stretched to the horizon as Harriet gazed out the window, passing sleepy hamlets and rolling pastures. Finally, she arrived at a tiny stop near a care home for the elderly. The care home's manager was surprised to see her, but admitted that a man named Edmund Marsh had been a resident many years before. He had passed away quietly, with no immediate family present, and his few belongings had eventually been donated to a charity shop in Ravenwood. That explained how the locket ended up in Harriet's hands. She asked if there were any records or notes from Edmund's stay, especially regarding Elizabeth. The manager produced a small file with only the barest details: date of birth, date of admission, date of death. However, it did note that Edmund had a single photograph he would never part with, though the staff had no idea who was in it. Despite the sparse information, Harriet felt a pang of sympathy for Edmund. He must have held on to the memory of Elizabeth until his final days. She wondered whether the caretaker had discovered her disappearance was not quite as simple as he'd first thought. Perhaps he had found a hidden clue. Or maybe the pain of losing her drained his life away. If Edmund had possessed the locket, it might mean he knew something that never made it into the official reports. Encouraged and saddened all at once, Harriet returned to Ravenwood, determined to follow the final thread. The Morton orchard. Although it was no longer in the Morton family, it still existed on the outskirts of the village, belonging to a distant cousin or a new family. Harriet spent an evening writing out her plan. The orchard was private property, so she would have to request permission to walk the grounds. She reached out to the new owner, Hugh Farnsworth, who seemed accommodating enough when Harriet explained she was researching local history. The next morning, Harriet arrived at the orchard, greeted by rows of gnarled apple trees. The crisp autumn air carried the sweet scent of ripe fruit. As Harriet wandered between the rows, her mind flicked between images of Elizabeth, the caretaker Edmund, and the stoic mother Margaret. Legends indicated the orchard had once been meticulously cared for, each tree name-tagged and pruned. Now, though, signs of slight neglect were present: fallen apples rotting underfoot, overgrown patches of nettle. She soon found the caretaker's old cottage. It was a small stone structure nestled at the orchard's edge, with boarded-up windows. If Harriet felt a twinge of unease, she resolved to look around. Farnsworth had left her with a skeleton key that supposedly opened the main door, warning her to mind the dusty interior. Harriet turned the key in the ancient lock, and with a creak the door swung open. Sunlight revealed a modest sitting room, a compact kitchen, and a narrow staircase leading upstairs. A sheet of dust covered everything: furniture, the cold fireplace, and the crooked mantel clock that had stopped ticking years ago. Harriet carefully stepped around debris, hunting for anything that might connect to Elizabeth's fate. A small desk beckoned in the corner. Harriet approached, her heart pounding with anticipation. The desk drawer was seized with rust, but after a bit of jiggling, it opened halfway. Inside she discovered a stack of fading letters tied with a string. Her breath caught as she realized the topmost letter bore the initials E.M. Harriet set the bundle on the dusty desk, gently untying the string. The first letter left her speechless. "Dearest Elizabeth," it began in an elegant hand. "Though I've watched over you all these years, it pains me to see your delight fade under the weight of your mother's expectations. You told me you yearned for more than this orchard, for a life beyond Ravenwood. I cannot deny you that chance, yet I wish you would reconsider. My heart aches at the thought of losing you forever." Harriet swallowed hard as she read a series of similarly heartfelt letters. Some were from Edmund to Elizabeth, others from Elizabeth to Edmund. In Elizabeth's final letter, her handwriting described a daring plan. She intended to leave Ravenwood secretly with a friend's help and then send for Edmund once she was safe and settled. Margaret disapproved of her daughter's wish to attend a prestigious art school in London. Harriet read Elizabeth's words, describing the heartbreak of a mother who wanted her daughter to stay close, while Elizabeth dreamed of a future filled with creativity and possibility. The expectations had seemed too restrictive, confining Elizabeth in a life she did not want. The final letter in the bundle looked as if the writer's pen had scratched in haste. "We had an argument, and then she left. I can't find her. Margaret parted from me in tears, blaming me. I fear the worst. Please, if you find any sign of her, let me know." Harriet realized this letter was from Mary Caldwell, Elizabeth's friend, imploring Edmund for help. So Elizabeth had not merely run away unannounced. Though that had been her intention, something must have happened the morning she planned to leave. Was it foul play, or did Elizabeth vanish along her journey? Harriet wondered if the orchard might hold one more clue. Carefully she ventured into the caretaker's bedroom upstairs. The floorboards creaked ominously. She moved a cobweb aside and noticed the corner of a trunk protruding from beneath the bed. Mustering her courage, she pulled the trunk into the open. Inside were old clothes, a pair of sturdy boots, and a few personal mementos. Skimming the contents, Harriet's gaze landed on a small leather notebook tied with twine. She looked inside the front cover. Elizabeth's name was written in a delicate script. The final pages told the rest of the story. Elizabeth wrote of the day she planned to leave. "Mother refused to say goodbye. I know she means well, but she's controlling me. Mary has arranged transportation. I'm waiting by the orchard gate. If I slip out quietly, no one need assume the worst." The final entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though Elizabeth had been interrupted while writing. Harriet exhaled a heavy sigh. The writing ended with no mention of an accident, no confession of a crime. Elizabeth's disappearance remained a mystery, but Harriet suspected that she truly had run away, with something unexpected cutting her writing short. Perhaps she worried her mother would discover the plan, or maybe Mary arrived sooner than expected. Harriet guessed that Elizabeth left in haste, leaving behind her notebook. Edmund found it later. He must have kept it all these years, hoping to piece together her fate. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Another theory came to Harriet then. Elizabeth had been estranged from her mother and had run off. If anyone had forced her to vanish or harmed her, the letters offered no direct proof. Yet Harriet noticed that none of Mary Caldwell's letters offered closure. Mary might have known the truth of Elizabeth's journey, but never shared it publicly. Why? Harriet decided to track down Mary, whom once moved away but might have returned or left a forwarding address. In her next step of research, Harriet discovered that Mary Caldwell was living in a nearby town. With some gentle persuasion and a promise to respect her privacy, Harriet arranged a meeting at a quaint tea shop. There, over steaming cups of Earl Grey, Mary revealed her side of the story. She was softly wrinkled with age, her hands trembling slightly as they held a small porcelain cup. "Elizabeth confided in me," Mary said, voice thick with regret. She was suffocating under her mother's expectations, and she feared that if she told Margaret ahead of time, her mother would never let her leave. Harriet nodded sympathetically. I found old letters in the caretaker's cottage. It seemed Edmund was very fond of Elizabeth, and they stayed in touch while she planned her departure. A sad smile ghosted over Mary's lips. It was like a father figure after Mr. Morton passed. We'd arranged for a friend of mine to drive Elizabeth to London. She was to stay with a cousin until she could enroll in art school. She waited near the orchard gate. I got her message, arrived to pick her up, but when I reached the orchard she was gone. She must have left just minutes before I arrived, or so I assumed at the time. "Where could she have gone?" Harriet asked softly. Mary sighed. "I looked for her everywhere around that area. I even thought she might have gone to say a final goodbye to the caretaker's cottage, but I never saw her. She didn't show up at my cousin's place in London. None of us ever heard from her again." Harriet's eyes glistened with compassion. "Did you report that to the authorities?" Mary cradled her teacup. "I did, and so did Edmund. But with no evidence of wrongdoing, the case went cold. Edmund never gave up. He wrote to me for years, hoping she'd reach out." Rubbing the tarnished locket in her pocket, Harriet felt a renewed sense of reverence for Edmund's devotion. "He must have carried her photograph everywhere." Mary nodded, tears brimming. "She was like a daughter to him." A shaky exhale escaped her lips. "I'd always prayed that Elizabeth made it out of Ravenwood safely. But wherever she went, if she survived, she never reached out. I couldn't understand it." Before they parted, Harriet asked Mary to note down any other details that might offer closure. Mary mentioned Elizabeth's paternal relatives in Scotland, whom Elizabeth had once mentioned contacting if she got truly desperate. Though the relatives had never heard from her, Harriet felt sure that was exactly where Elizabeth had gone in the end. Perhaps she reached them in secret. Maybe she was too ashamed or afraid to write home, or perhaps something else prevented her from making contact. Without further evidence, Harriet had only speculation. Yet, as Harriet left the tea shop, she realized that the disappearance might not be so sinister after all. The caretaker's letters, Elizabeth's notebook, and Mary's testimony told a story of a young woman longing for freedom and new horizons. Ravenwood's official version of the story, overshadowed by rumors of tragedy and foul play, never took into account Elizabeth's passionate desire to escape. Harriet suspected Elizabeth's abrupt departure was a mixture of poorly timed coincidences and frantic last-minute decisions. A week later, Harriet held a quiet gathering at her cottage for some of the older villagers who remembered the Morton orchard. She carefully displayed Edmund's letters and Elizabeth's final notebook entry. While no one could be absolutely certain of Elizabeth's fate, Harriet presented them with what she believed to be the simplest explanation: that Elizabeth had slipped away that morning, travelling only far enough to vanish from Ravenwood's watchful eyes. Perhaps she changed her name, built a new life, and never looked back. It was bittersweet, but there was comfort in imagining that Elizabeth found the independence she so desperately craved. The villagers, who had once breathed in the gloom of a tragic legend, now felt an unexpected sense of resolution. The caretaker Edmund was no criminal, merely a devoted friend and father figure who loved Elizabeth enough to let her find her own way. News of this new perspective rippled quietly through Ravenwood, softening the edges of the old mystery. A rumor grew that Elizabeth might have become a painter of renown under a pseudonym, an idea that set tongues wagging whenever a visitor spotted an unsigned painting at a local fair or rummage sale. Harriet locked the letters and notebook in a small chest for safekeeping, planning eventually to donate them to the local historical society so Elizabeth's story would not be lost. She slipped the locket around her neck one final time and studied the two photographs, the teenage girl, so spirited even in a faded image, and the older woman, motherly but overshadowed by sorrow. Harriet's heart twinged for both. As the harvest festival arrived, the village bustled with renewed life. Children scurried through the streets, squealing with joy, while neighbors chatted over pies and jams. On the festival's opening day, Harriet strolled past the old orchard stands, wondering if Elizabeth had once walked the same path. brimming with a secret ambition no one else understood. Harriet found it comforting that, although Ravenwood's orchard had grown quiet, new seeds of understanding had been planted in the villagers' hearts. She paused by a tapestry booth, where a skilled artisan displayed vibrant scenes of local farmland. One piece showed a figure standing under an apple tree, gazing at the horizon with a suitcase in hand. Harriet smiled, entertained by the uncanny coincidence. She thought of Elizabeth Morton, who had longed to break free from Ravenwood's boundaries to find her own path in the world. Mystery remained. Harriet didn't know with absolute certainty what happened, but she did know that Ravenwood's greatest, unsolved puzzle had, at last, found a measure of peace, and in the gentle hum of the festival, with the warm breeze on her cheek, Harriet felt sure that the village had finally laid the old tragedy to rest.